This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey everybody and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Jan, also known as Sydney Plant Guy, and I love growing large aroids indoors. If you'd ask me what my YouTube channel is all about, I'll tell you that, well, it's all about plants, but most importantly, it's all about experience-based care tips for your plants. I'm a big believer of talking about experiences, and I've been growing plants for over 3 years, and in those 3 years, I made a lot of mistakes, I learned a lot of lessons, and I've gone through a lot of trial and error. So I thought, why not share these mistakes with you so you don't need to make them yourself? But of course, pretty much every single video that I've recorded is based on my experience I made over the last 3 years. So there are some mistakes and lessons learned scattered all throughout my videos, but in this video today specifically, I want to point out 10 mistakes I made in the past. I want to try something a little bit different. Instead of just me giving you 10 mistakes that I made, I would love this to be a little bit more collaborative. So pop a comment down below and let me know a mistake that you have made and the lesson learned from that mistake so that we can all learn from each other. But before we get into the video, I would like to talk about today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with over thousands of courses and members across 150 countries. It's a place to get inspired, learn new skills, and then put them to work in an impactful way. Just under 6 months ago, I created this YouTube channel, and the thing I like the least about video creation is the editing part. I feel like I'm not really good at it. I really just taught myself the basics so I can get some videos out for you to enjoy. But ultimately, the better I get at editing, the faster it will get and the more I'll enjoy it. So I was interested in looking up a few video editing courses on Skillshare, and I found a great one by Misjudging Batista called Wondershare Filmora, the complete video editing course. And there's this one skill that I learned that was really easy and I implemented straight away, and I think it's going to be something that I'm going to use in a lot of videos going forward. And what is that? I learned how to easily multiply myself, so now you get to enjoy 2 of us. Anyway, I'll go back and watch a few more courses, so I'll leave it with you. Well, that's a great skill to have, and I can't wait to put it to use more often. I love that Skillshare isn't just another holiday sale asking you to buy more stuff, consume more. It's doing quite the opposite. It's asking you to take a little break and invest in yourself, invest in your passions, be curious and learn new skills, and hopefully you can implement them in your life in an impactful way and really make a difference. And the best thing is, Skillshare is offering the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description below a free 1-month trial. Again, thank you Skillshare for sponsoring this video, so let's get back into it. I also want to quickly talk about this amazing plant over here. It is my Philodendron Plowmanii narrow form, and it just popped out this amazing new leaf. And from the back as well, it has the most amazing cute back and these really nice ruffled petioles. So yeah, I thought this plant was too pretty to not share with you today. But let's get started. Mistake number 1, overwatering. And that's probably the mistake that most new plant hobbyists make. They overwater their plants because it's kind of, intuitive to think that, well, if watering is the one thing I need to do for my plants, the more often I do it, the better for my plant, right? Like you're basically over loving it. You're killing it with kindness almost, right? You're trying to do the right thing, but it's not necessarily the right thing. And of course, if we're also thinking about where most of these aroids come from, they're from tropical rainforests. So it makes sense to think that they really like water. And they do really like water. But what they also love is drainage, aeration, and airflow. And that's usually what we don't have indoors. We are limited by growing them in pots. And plants don't necessarily like growing in pots. There are no indoor plants. Every plant comes from the outdoor world. Just some plants adapt a little bit better to be grown indoors, but that doesn't mean that any plant actually appreciates a pot. And like evolution would have gone really wrong if a plant actually prefers a pot over living outdoors. So the pot is really the problem, not the overwatering. It's not the frequency or the volume of water that you give your plant, because in a tropical rainforest it could rain non-stop and could rain quite a lot, right? So it's not the frequency and the volume of water. It's really the pot and the potting medium that you use that makes the frequency and the volume of water that you use a problem. When we talk about overwatering, we're usually referring to the problem of root rot. Root rot means that your roots rot, and they usually rot because of bacterial infections. Now, bacterial infections can come from a lot of things. it could just be bacteria that was already in your potting medium and you did nothing wrong, and it just affected your roots, and once the bacteria is there, it can spread pretty quickly. But most of the time, we are actually encouraging this bacteria by creating a really perfect environment for the bacteria to thrive in, which is predominantly a mix that doesn't necessarily have aeration and drainage. These aroid roots love oxygen. So if you want them to be happy and healthy, you want to provide them with a lot of fresh air. How do I get air into my potting mix? Well, I have created an aroid mix that is made out of a lot of chunky materials like bark, cocoa chips, chunky perlite, chunky pumice. It has a few water retentive components as well, like cocoa peat. The cocoa chips actually retain quite a bit of water as well. But overall, I want this mix to be really nice and chunky so that when I water it, water just drains out really, really quickly, and not much water is actually retained within the mix. Of course, it retains a little bit of moisture. I mean, that's the whole point of the substrate, right? We want the plant to have water to drink from over here. But predominantly, it has a lot of air pockets. Let me show you what these air pockets do. All right, this is a plant I potted up in my aroid mix a couple of weeks ago. And you can see that there's all of this condensation in these little air pockets. And these roots are really finding these spots and they're loving it. They love this hot, humid, or they love this warm, humid air in between these chunky components of my aroid mix, and they're really thriving. So with a chunky mix like this, I don't really need to worry about the volume of water because all excess is just going to drain through. And I don't really need to worry about frequency of watering either because the water, there isn't really that much water retention within it. If anything, the one thing I do need to worry about is actually underwatering my plants because there aren't many components in here that retain the moisture. So I need to make sure that when my plant needs water, that I provide it to them. So what that means is I water more frequently, but I eliminate risk of poor root health. So if you have a bit of time on your hand or you're willing to put the effort and the more frequent watering into your journey, then I highly recommend getting a nice chunky aerated mix. Now what you usually get is, or when you buy something from the nursery, and sorry, this is already soaking wet because as I said, I already recorded this video and I just didn't have my microphone plugged in. What you usually get is these store-bought potting mediums, and this is already so heavy. You can see there's not really any sort of air pockets on the side of the pot. And I mean, you can't tell, but this one on the right is probably twice as heavy as the one on the left, despite the fact that it's the same volume. When you water these mixes, a lot of the water is retained and it drains out really, really slowly. Obviously not that slowly because I just poured a whole lot of stuff in here. Over time, this will compact more and more because you don't have these nice chunky components like perlite and pumice. So over time, this will become really, really dense and doesn't really provide the roots with a lot of air pockets, like oxygen. The roots want the oxygen. The oxygen is just in the air pockets, right? So you're basically not aerating your mix for optimum root health. It retains a lot more moisture, so you need to water less frequently, but you do need to worry about the root health a little bit more. You need to be much more careful in assessing whether your potting medium needs water or not. If you water it without it actually requiring watering, then you're running risk of waterlogged potting mixes, and then that water is, that basically is the opposite of aeration, which provides a perfect environment for bacteria to thrive, and you will end up with root rot. The thing is, when we're buying them from our nurseries, a lot of the plants come in these really fine mixes and the plants are thriving, but that's because they're grown in like perfect conditions. They're grown in really warm, hot, humid greenhouses, so that these plants actually use a lot of water, so they don't need to worry about overwatering their plants because the plants are thriving. They're in the perfect conditions. Once you put them in your environment where it's probably cooler than a greenhouse, not as much light as in a greenhouse, the plant is going to use less water. So you just need to be much more careful with your watering. That's my number one mistake I made at the beginning. My mix just wasn't good enough. It was not really giving my plants enough aeration and drainage. And at the same time, these store-bought potting mixes come with a whole lot of pests, specifically fungus nets in them. So the second I stopped using store-bought potting mixes, I also never really had any fungus net issues ever again. So really, probably the biggest mistake people make at the beginning, they're not using a nice chunky aroid mix for their aroids. Keep in mind, I pretty much just talk about aroids on my channel, right? Most of the plants that I grow are aroids. If I ever talk about a plant that is not an aroid and is in a different mix to that, I will let you know. Like the oxalis, for example, has much finer roots, so it would actually prefer this mix over the chunky aroid mix. But I'm assuming that you came here for aroids. Maybe a good segue into the next mistake that I made. At the beginning, I was really aiming for pest eradication. I saw a spider mite or one thrip. Is it one thrip? One thrips? I don't know. I don't think they ever come as just one. Anyway, let's say you see a few spider mites or a few thrips somewhere. I absolutely freaked out. Panic, straight away. Oh my God, what have I done wrong? I'm such a poor plant parent. Like, I'm such a bad plant parent, and so on, right? At the beginning, I freaked out whenever I see any pests, and it really kind of took a lot of fun out of this hobby. Until I really changed my mindset. I'm no longer aiming for pest eradication. It's completely unrealistic to think that with all of the plants that I have, with open windows pretty much all day, every day, that I wouldn't have any pests in my environment. That's ridiculous. By the way, these pests can be just, they can just come here through wind. They can fly, they can jump, they can whatever. For pests to transfer from one plant to the other, these leaves do not have to touch. They can be taken with the wind and so on. So keep that in mind. But at the beginning, I really aimed for pest eradication, and it's absolutely impossible. So I really stopped trying that. Instead, I'm really trying to proactively prevent pests from rocking up in the first place, or from really taking a hold of my plants so that it could become an outbreak. So what do? Is I'm just trying to keep my plants as healthy as possible. Healthy plants have a much easier time fighting off pests. Clean, healthy leaves also give pests a much harder time to actually really settle in. So I just spray my leaves with water whenever I can to get rid of any dust, cat hair, and any pests that are just sitting on there sucking the life out of my leaf. Now, it's not going to eradicate the leaf. You're not getting rid of them. You haven't treated them just yet, but you're actually stopping the problem right now. Of course, I do use pest treatments as well. I use Vitality Plus for spider mites and Confidor Spray for thrips. But I don't actually need to use it as often as you might think, given the amount of plants that I have, because I consistently, proactively try to stop any pest outbreaks in the first place. Plus, if I see a spider mite here and there, I don't care. They can stay. It's okay. I stopped worrying, because it doesn't matter how much you worry, it's not actually going to change anything about the pests being there. So I feel like the earlier you incorporate that into your mindset, and you can just chill about them. Of course, stop them from, really taking over and causing damage. But don't worry if you see a couple of pests here and there. All right, next mistake that I made was potting my plants up way too early. Of course, you get that new cutting or you get that new plant and you just want to pot it up in that pot that you want, in that mix that you want, and you wanted to do it now. Like, we're all impatient, I get it. Whether or not your plant is ready to be potted up does not depend on if you put it on a moss pole. It does not depend on the size of the leaves or the size of the plant. It depends on the size of the root system. And that doesn't matter if you then chuck a pole in that same pot or if you don't put a pole in that same pot. You want to pot up your plant whenever the root system tells you that the roots that it's ready. Let's have a couple of examples, and I come a bit closer. Okay, example number one, this cutting has one root over here, and that's it. Now, if I pot this up, if I damage that one root, it's pretty much game over for that cutting. So ideally, I would love for there to be two roots, and I would also love for that root over here to have secondary roots. So I would pop that back in water and not pot it up. This cutting, however, has multiple roots, so even if I would damage one of the roots when potting it up, it should be fine. Plus, I don't know if you can see that, some of these primary roots have small secondary roots over here. I could totally leave this in water for another couple of weeks. And if you're ever not sure whether or not your plant is ready for potting up, just wait a couple more weeks. Can't hurt them. But this one would be ready to go. Next one, growing the wrong plants. Now, how do you know whether you're growing the right or wrong plants? Sometimes all it takes is trial and error, but sometimes you can also just judge it by other people that are living in similar conditions as you are and looking up what plants thrive in their environment. At the beginning, I made the mistake thinking that every time a plant doesn't do well, it is my mistake. I did something wrong with its care. I gave it the wrong potting medium. I watered it too much. I didn't water it enough. I didn't stay on top of pest treatment. I gave it too much light, too little light, and so on. Sometimes it's not you. Sometimes it's the plant. Really differentiate between environment and care. Yes, you can control your care approach. You can do all of that. But you can do all of that correctly. If the plant is not given the environmental conditions that it actually needs to survive and or thrive, then there's nothing you can do on the care side of things that's going to overcome all of these environmental challenges. So essentially, the wrong plant to grow is a plant that is not suitable for your environment. For example, if you live in Europe and you are wanting to grow a queen anthurium that appreciates 90% humidity and hot temperatures all year round, you are going to fail. That plant is not going to have a good time. It has nothing to do with your potting medium, your setup, the light, or whatever. It's just purely not going to be happy based on just one environmental factor, which is humidity or potentially humidity and temperature. There's other plants that you might never be able to provide enough light in an indoor setting, so it's never going to thrive indoors. Ultimately, there's no list of plants that are right or wrong because I don't know your environment. But if there is a plant and you feel like you're doing everything correctly from a care approach and it's still not thriving, don't blame yourself for it. Like, you might be doing everything right and it might just be the wrong plant for your environment. Next one, inconsistency. Whenever I do a video talking about things that you should do, I mention consistency because you should really be consistent with your plants. So, not a huge shock that inconsistency is a very common mistake. So what people often do is they're super motivated at the beginning and they take great care of their plant, but these are living organisms. It doesn't really matter what I've done over the last 3 years to get all of my plants to thrive. If I would just stop looking after my plants for a month, they would all die. So your plants are only as good as the care you give them then and there. Like whatever you've done in the past, yeah, of course, got them to the spot that they're in right now, but you need to consistently look after them. Consider that when adding another plant to your collection, are you going to be able to look after that plant consistently for, the next few years ongoingly? Is that plant that you're now adding to your collection maybe making you stop looking after some other plants in your collection? And so on. So consistency is key. Which leads me to the next one, going too hard, too fast. And that's a mistake I definitely made at the beginning. At the beginning, you want to grow all of the plants in the world. So you just go out and compensate for the lack of growth that your existing plants give you by buying more and more. Guilty, definitely guilty. All that resulted in is me killing a whole lot of plants or me having so many plants that I can't actually provide all of the plants with the conditions that they would need to thrive. So some are just getting neglected to the extent that I just don't really like them and then just pop them on the balcony and then they die out there. So that's obviously a waste of resources for all of us. It's not necessarily fair on the plants as well. But at some stage, you gotta just choose quality over quantity. So basically, in a nutshell, the mistake I don't want you to make is going too hard too fast. Get a plant at a time, get them onboarded into your environment, make them happy, and then once you've figured out what their plant wants, go on to the next one. If you go too hard, too fast, it might be going okay for a couple of months. Suddenly you have your first pest outbreak. You've never dealt with it. You still need to make your mistakes. And now, instead of making that mistake on one plant and learn from it, you might make that mistake on 20 plants. You still learn the same lesson, but you kill 20 plants instead of just one. So really, go one at a time, make your lessons, and then really start building your collection as you get more experience. I started off with pothos and monsteras only. Then I slowly started getting into philodendron and then velvet philodendrons. I think a year into my plant journey, a year and a half into my plant journey, I started with anthuriums. I didn't touch anthuriums until a year and a half into my journey. By then, I've learned all about making the correct mix. I've set up an IKEA cabinet to give them great conditions and so on. I learned about all of these plants. I learned about fertilizing. I learned about pest treatment and routines and so on. And only then I started really adding these more finicky, complex plants because, well, I don't necessarily want to make these really basic learnings, or I don't want to make these really basic mistakes with a $500 plant or a plant that I really don't want to lose. Go easy, one step at a time, and don't make the mistake of going too hard, too fast, even though it can be really tempting. Next mistake is underestimating the importance of airflow, specifically if you're growing plants on a moss pole, if you have an IKEA cabinet, or if you have any sort of really high humidity environment. Airflow is super, super important for plant health. By the way, on that note, maybe very closely related to it, don't bother misting your plants. If you're misting your plants, you might actually cause more damage than good. Water sitting on your leaves in combination with no airflow is definitely going to give you fungal issues at some stage. So your moss pole can get moldy, your leaves can get fungal issues, your potting mix can get fungal issues, and so on. And we don't really want that. Plus, when you grow indoors, airflow is also really important for the health of your apartment and for your health. You are adding a lot of water to your environment by keeping your plants and your moss poles moist. So I pretty much have my windows open at all times, and I love having fans on as well to really make sure the air is always circulating. There's always fresh air. Well, fresh air also brings new CO2 to the plants that they can convert into oxygen and so on. Don't get confused between airflow and a draft. When people say plants don't like draft, they're mainly referring to a very heavy, consistent, cold wind coming towards your plants. Well, they don't like that. Airflow is really just a little bit of air circulating. It doesn't need to be like windy, right? The leaves don't need to be waving in the wind. As long as the air is just moving and not completely stale, it will do the trick. All right, next one, misjudging light levels. Now, this is really, really hard to get right at the beginning because light is just really hard to judge with eyesight. It's also really hard to judge on a photo or on a video because cameras adjust light levels. So just because the camera makes something look really dark or really bright doesn't at all mean that it's actually a bright or a dark spot. Light also changes throughout the day, throughout the seasons, heavily dependent on the weather and so on. So judging light levels is really hard. Measuring light levels is also really hard because one measurement is also not really going to tell you the true story. You need to take a bunch of measurements and take some sort of average because right now over here it looks pretty dark, but in the morning the sun is just beaming in here. So if I take a light meter reading in the morning, it would tell me that it's way too much sun. If I take one right now, it might tell me that it's not enough sun. So I don't really bother with light meter readings. I want the plants to tell me the story. Now, really the mistake I made at the very beginning is misinterpreting some of these terms that people use to define light. Shaded does not mean dark. It is not in your bathroom without a window. That is not a shaded spot. That is just darkness. A shaded area, like think about it, think about being like in a park and you sit down under a tree. That's shaded. There's still a whole lot of light there, but you have a little bit of shade from that tree above. Bright indirect light. Basically, the focus is on bright. It's still really bright light. You're not putting it in a dark corner of your apartment, and just because it doesn't get direct light, that means that it's straight away indirect and bright. Bright indirect light really just means that the sun doesn't hit it straight away, or like it doesn't hit it directly, so it's not going to burn it, but the plant is still exposed to a whole lot of light. So I love the way that Houseplant Journal actually explains it. Imagine you're a leaf and the leaf is looking at the sky. The more sky the leaf can see, the more light exposure it gets. So for example, that plant down here sitting on the floor, looking out the window, it can see a whole lot of sky. It doesn't get direct sun over here, but I can see a lot of the sky, so it will get a lot of bright indirect light. A leaf that's growing all the way up the moss pollens at the very top, it's higher than the window. That leaf has no view of the sky at all. If that leaf would have eyes and looks up, all it sees is ceiling. So that's I love that explanation of bright indirect light. You want to maximize the view of the sky your plant has while not giving it direct sun that could burn it. It's totally fine to have a bit of direct sun in the morning and in the afternoon when the sun is really low. It's kind of impossible to avoid it, to be honest. But you really want to avoid that harsh afternoon direct sun. That's the sun you don't necessarily want to have beaming on your aroids. You want that for your veggies or anything like for your trees outdoors, but not necessarily for your aroids indoors. So really consider what is bright indirect light and let the plant tell you the story whether or not you have interpreted these terms correctly. If your plants are not growing, not increasing in leaf size, growing really leggy, then you're probably not giving them enough light. All right, next mistake. I have made a lot of mistakes with moss poles over the last few years to the extent that I have now perfected my approach. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong. There's so many ways of constructing a moss pole or constructing a support. But for my needs and what I find easy, for the things that I have available, I feel like I have perfected my approach and I'm really, really happy with it. And I reckon the results kind of speak for themselves as well. What mistakes have I made with moss poles over the years? Well, first mistake is at the beginning, I gave my plants smaller moss poles and I just extend them more often. That's silly. Have a long-term vision. That plant is eventually going to grow up that full moss pole anyway, so might as well just give it a full moss pole. Stops you from having to do all of these extensions. Less work for you. You can spend that work on doing something else with your plants, but also every joint makes the pole a little bit less stable. That way works really well for me. So all of my poles are always 90 centimeters in height. They're also about 6 centimeters in diameter. I found that to be the sweet spot between being big enough to actually hold enough moss, but also skinny enough to not take up a whole lot of moss. Moss is a precious resource as well. It's not always the cheapest. So you don't necessarily want to use more unless you really have to. So I found 6 centimeters to be perfect. That way with one pack of moss, I can make 6 moss poles, and that works really well for me. If you make them too skinny, you don't have enough moss in there, but you still have a really large surface area, which basically means that your moss pole is going to dry out super, super quickly. If you don't fill your moss pole with enough moss, you also don't have enough moss to retain moisture, which also means it's going to dry out really, really quickly. If you make your moss pole too thick, then the surface can dry out really quickly, but the inside is consistently staying moist. There's not going to be enough airflow going through that center of the moss pole, so you're potentially running risk of fungal issues and so on. So I found 6 centimeters to just be the perfect medium between too little and too much moss, keeping it moist, but also not staying moist for too long to potentially cause any issues. So that's at least what I found. But again, somebody else could have made other experiences and that could also work, right? There's not just one way to success. Also, with a 6 centimeter diameter, the pole has a decent enough base to actually be able to stand up by itself. If it was any skinnier, the base wouldn't necessarily be large enough to compensate for the height and it would just kind of wobble around. So I found the 6 centimeters to also be a kind of stable option. And the cylinder form is also really structurally sound. So that's what I've learned about the moss. So when I fill it, I would say I give it a 6 out of 10. I don't really densely pack the moss in there, but I also don't just loosely flake it in there. It's a 6 out of 10 with 0 being empty and 10 being like as dense as possible. 6 out of 10. Right, and then the last mistake doesn't necessarily correspond to the construction of the moss pole, but the use of the moss pole. So I noticed that people are waiting way too long to give their plants a moss pole. Always set up your plants on a moss pole when they're still small. The whole idea behind the moss pole is that you're keeping it moist, and then every single node is going to climb up your moss pole, growing roots into the moss pole. Those roots will be provided with water and nutrients, basically giving the plant a huge root system and a lot of access to water and nutrients, enabling it to grow nice and large. If you're taking a really long vine and you're just chucking it on the moss pole in hindsight, first of all, it already reached the top of the moss pole without actually growing on the moss pole. So I don't understand. I don't know, what's the purpose of adding it in hindsight? The plant is already reaching the top, so the whole purpose of the moss pole is that it climbs up the moss pole, but I already reached it. I just don't understand why you would do that. But the second thing is also the plant is not going to attach to the moss pole in hindsight, or very, very unlikely unless you're giving it like 90% humidity. Usually how plants work is that the growth is being sent to the newest node. All of the growth hormones go to the growth top because that's where the plant wants to grow from, which also means that all of the older nodes are not necessarily been given that many growth hormones by the plant, meaning that they're very unlikely to grow new roots into the pole in hindsight. Not impossible, but very unlikely, at least in an indoor environment. So to me, it makes absolutely no sense to take an existing plant and just twist it around the moss pole or to pin it on the moss pole. If your plant has already reached a decent size without using a moss pole, then why bother? You're just creating a whole lot of work for yourself, trying to keep that moss pole moist, but your plant is not going to get any of the benefits from that moss pole because it hasn't grown any roots into the moss pole. And then when you actually do water it, the mistake that I see people do a lot is they just missed it. You're literally just scratching the surface of it. Of course that's going to dry out really quickly. Look at the size of that surface area. There's so much surface area. If you're just misting the surface, there's also just going to be a lot of water evaporating really quickly. When you water your moss pole, water it from the inside out. Water it thoroughly so the inside can stay nice and moist. That's where the roots are. The outside can dry out a little bit quicker. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to moisten your moss pole again. So if you water your moss poles thoroughly, they should stay moist for much, much longer than if you just consistently mist them. Alrighty, those were 10 mistakes that I have made, and I wanted to share them with you so you don't need to make the same mistakes yourself. I would love for you to actually check out my full collection of crawlers so you can also see what this Plumania looked like a few months ago when it was still nice and small. In that video, I also talk a little bit more about these really nice rectangular pots, and there's a link in the description of that video if you want to purchase them. So check out that video. I'll link it over here for you. Like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment, and I'll see you next time around. Bye.